Okay, thank you. So after that fascinating talk, I'm going to bring you back down to earth, back to the nursery, to discuss oxygen for preterm infants, but particularly I'm not going to really discuss the whole preterm. I'm going to concentrate around the resuscitation period because that's the transition. What do we do? What do we know? How should we be going? So I'm really going to tell you now what I'm going to say, and then you can all go to sleep and wake up at the end. So babies are blue at birth, and they have an oxygen saturation in utero of about 50 or 60%, and in the first minute or two it's 50 or 60%, probably even lower after they've been born. And because of that, everybody gives oxygen. And my old boss used to say, we'll christen the babies with oxygen. They came out and we gave every baby some oxygen. But this is one of the crucial things that I'm going to emphasize because it's not emphasized. The NRP, all the neonatal resuscitation guidelines say, assess the baby, and they're changing now, but it used to be if the baby's blue, give it oxygen. No. That's not the first thing to do. The first thing is to get the lungs aerated. Okay, giving oxygen to a baby who hasn't got his lungs aerated is not going to do any good. So we've got to get the lungs open. And that's not in any of the guidelines at the moment, okay? There's about ventilation. But don't even think about oxygen. Don't worry about it until you've got the lungs open. Help the baby achieve an FRC. I talked about that yesterday. I'm going to say a bit more. Support breathing, sustained inflation, CPAP, PEEP, right? Get the lungs open. Now, we've all given 100% oxygen in the past. Thank goodness we're changing because but it actually stops the baby's breathing. Only for a short while, but it inhibits the first breaths, and it's very toxic. I'll show you that. Pulse oximetry, I said about heart rate, now we're dealing with oxygen. And here, if the heart rate's not rising, the problem is ventilation. Okay? Why is the baby bradycardic at birth? One thing that's never discussed, but is almost certainly one of the major causes, is that there is a vagal bradycardia immediately after birth. For reasons which we could discuss, I won't go into, but there's a vagal bradycardia. But if the heart rate is slow, it is simply an indication that the myocardium is hypoxic. How do you get the heart rate up? Get the lungs aerated, get the oxygen into the circulation, and then the heart rate picks up. So a slow heart rate is a problem with ventilation. Primarily, oxygenation is related to that. So we know that the SpO2 rises slowly after birth, and using Dawson charts, which I'm going to show you, we'll use that to titrate. So there you are, there's the whole talk. Now let's go through it again. Oxygen has been considered to be wonderful stuff. You're all sitting there pink because there's 21% oxygen in the atmosphere. Keeps us alive, turns cyanose babies pink, maintains cerebral function, maintains other organs. And this wonderful English guy back in 1975, oxygen's vital, not just useful. 1 breath of oxygen is worth 5 breaths of air in this situation, neonatal resuscitation. Why 5 breaths? Well, oxygen, air's 21%, 100% is 5 times more. That was his logic. We have this statement. I'll show you where it comes from in a minute. We are so accustomed to think of oxygen as universally beneficent that it is a new approach to think of this as a risk hazard which a baby may not satisfactorily surmount. All right, oxygen universally beneficent, new approach to think of it as a hazard. Who said that? A funny old lady, Kate Campbell, who was the first neonatologist in Melbourne. 1951, she had a paper, Intensive Oxygen with a Possible Cause of Retrolental Fibroplasia. She looked after virtually all the sick babies in the middle of Melbourne. And what was interesting was that she looked after them in 3 different hospitals. One was a private hospital where there was money, and money meant you could treat the babies properly, and they gave them lots of oxygen. And the other two were public hospitals where they didn't have any money, so they didn't give them oxygen. And she noticed that actually if you gave oxygen, we were getting problems. But look, right back in 1951, I mean, you know, this is the sort of thing we'd be saying now, and yet Kate Campbell was saying it then. Oxygen and resuscitation. We started using oxygen for resuscitation because it seemed like a good idea. We now use it because we always have. And this is one of my themes in a whole variety of talks. We're stuck in history if we're not careful. We've got to move on. We're stuck in history, resuscitating with self-inflating bags, which are probably the worst designed thing for resuscitating babies, particularly premature babies. We've been giving oxygen because we always have, and it's been amazing, this whole business of trying to change the concept from using 100% oxygen to using less, that people are so reactionary. I've always done it, therefore it must be good. So, how much oxygen should we use to treat a preterm baby? And this is really not just birth, but later on. And here is our old friend and mentor, Bill Silverman. Despite 50 years of research, not a shred of evidence to guide us regarding the appropriate limits, minimizing 4 competing risks of damage, chronic lung disease. Now, that was 2004. In the last few years, we really are getting some data to help us sort this out a bit. There is still a lot more to be done. All right, I mean, I could give a whole lecture on this, but I'm not a biochemist, and it's all very cell biology, but basically oxygen is a very dangerous drug. It should be locked up in the dangerous drug cupboard and only got out under prescription. The idea that you can just go and turn it on, give it to anybody, is because it's lovely stuff, wonderful, cures all ills. It increases free radicals, leads to chronic lung disease, retinopathy, nectar, all sorts of things. The oxygen defenses develop in the 3rd trimester. Very premature babies are at risk from oxygen more than term babies, but even term babies are very considerably at risk from oxygen. Now, I'm not going into it, but there's been masses of work out of Oslo from Ola Saugsted's unit showing how toxic oxygen is to the newly born infant and, of course, animals. So you'll just have to take it that this is a dangerous drug. And I just put this bit down the bottom there. Oops, that wasn't quite what I was expecting to come up. It will come up. I'm going to show you more about the mortality in a minute. All right, so come back to the beginning. Here's our tiny little baby. Can't imagine, can you, putting it on CPAP a few years ago. Okay, we've got to be trying to improve lung volume. And okay, I said a lot of this yesterday, but I don't apologize for saying it again. At birth, the lung is unaerated. It's the only time in life when you have your lung full of fluid. You've got to get that fluid out in order to exchange gases, and you've got to do it quickly. If you're a preterm baby, you struggle to do that because your ribs and muscles and ribs are just cave in. They're not big ribs like adults have. CPAP improves lung volume, oxygenation, respiratory drive, all these good things. So the first thing you've got to be thinking about when you're trying to improve a baby during the transition period is getting the lungs open and keeping them open. Okay, we had all that message yesterday, but it's all about oxygen, oxygenation before you even think of giving oxygen. And I showed you some of this graph yesterday, AADO2. This is what happens if you give PEEP. You improve oxygenation, give a bit of surfactant. Look, this is the first 15 minutes. If you want to improve oxygenation, give a distending pressure, an end expiratory pressure, rather than give oxygen. If you get this sort of effect, you don't need to, you probably don't need to even think about giving oxygen at all. So just a little baby, just we showed you some of this yesterday. I don't know why I could have given you another video, but here's a little guy being put in a polythene bag, given CPAP. Hey, good guys, they're getting the baby's lungs going. But these were the days when we were using 100% oxygen. Now, here's a fellow putting on the pulse oximeter. You can put on a pulse oximeter. Actually, it's a man doing it. Usually it all falls off when the men do it. The nurses are better at doing it. Put it on, then plug it in, and within 20 seconds or so of plugging it in, we start to get a reading as to what's happening. So get your arm out of the way, please. There's the saturation, there's the heart rate. Oh, got a heart rate less than 100. You should be ventilating this baby. Oh no, it's coming up. Oh look, the heart rate's coming up. Okay. Sticks at 95, don't panic, that's within the normal range. Saturation 78, 80, coming up. Heart rate's now above 100. Nice little baby, isn't it? Little baby, so should we give oxygen? No, this is perfectly normal. But actually they're giving 100%, and you will see in a minute. Takes a little while, lungs clearing of fluid. This baby will rapidly hyperoxygenate. Hyperoxygenate. Interesting, just note the heart rate's still down there. Nobody cares about that. There's a good plethysmographic signal down here. Babies can have a heart rate in this range. Baby's breathing gone over pink. Good pleth signal, and the heart rate is relatively slow. Don't worry about the heart rate. The baby's got good tone and it's breathing. But this is good for getting the lungs open. If you give it too much oxygen, you'll over-oxygenate the baby right from the start. Okay, so let's just move on. Here's the American Neonatal Resuscitation Program. It's changing since I made this slide, but nevertheless, if the newborn is breathing but central cyanosis is present, give oxygen. And so one of the things we did with many of these resuscitation guidelines was we said, oh, that's an interesting statement. If it's central cyanosis is present, is your cyanosis the same as my cyanosis? How good are people at assessing this? And so we did a study, Colin O'Donnell did a study of 27 staff, each looking at 5 minutes from 20 high-quality videos of infants receiving various resuscitation maneuvers. Saturation was on the right wrist, but it was masked. A clock was visible, and the observers were just told to note the time when the infant became pink. Now, this study has been criticized because people say, oh, you know, you can't tell pinkness from a video, it depends. These people are all seeing exactly the same video, so whether the color is perfect or not, they're all seeing the same thing. And the interesting things were the mean SpO2 when people thought the baby looked pink was 69%. Don't get too excited about that, because the SpO2 when the baby thought looked pink varied from 10% to 100%, and many infants thought the infant didn't look pink even when the saturation was greater than 92%. And here are 20 babies and their oxygen saturation when people thought the baby looked pink. So let's just go through this. So here's baby 2. Somebody said the baby looked pink when its saturation was about 10. Somebody else said it looked pink when its saturation was 50. And this is the variation between the people for just that one baby. You can take another one, anything from up there. These are just ranked in order of how high the median was. But you can see enormous variation in each baby as to when people thought the baby went pink. So I'm sorry guys, but neonatologists guess when a baby looks pink. And so if you can't get it right, then you're going to give oxygen at the wrong time and just have the big banner in the sky that oxygen is toxic. We all have different perceptions of pinkness, and so let's get away from these subjective assessments and start using something objective, and we will monitor the baby's oxygen with the SpO2. So again, I don't really want to show that. Come back. Here is pulse oximetry. Look, you can see what's happening. Much better than guessing, because we can't guess. And I haven't shown you the data, but people on heart rate, that's about as bad. So we did that. Okay, so now we can get saturations from the right hand in less than 90 seconds, depends how quickly you get on with putting it on. The problem is that we've got the saturations and we don't know how to interpret them within the minutes after birth. And this has been quite a big problem. I don't know what your experience is. You say to people, use the saturation monitor, and they put it on and they, my God, this baby's saturation's 50, it's 60, it's whatever. Well, we better give oxygen because that's too low. So we need to know how to interpret saturation. And that's one of the things I say. The pulse oximeter is really very good for heart rate, because you know about that. But the fact is that the saturation during the first few minutes is low. Don't worry that it's low. They've been doing this for the last few months. Many may be down to 30. And so Jennifer Dawson, who just done a PhD with me, we set about saying we need to have some normal values. And this was published last year in Pediatrics. They studied well over 468 babies getting pulse oximetry during the first few minutes of life from a whole variety of babies. And this is data, I really showed you the heart rate yesterday, babies who had no medical interventions in the delivery room. 2/3 of them are term babies, 1/3 are preterm, very few are extremely preterm. And what we've constructed here is centile charts, like we have with growth charts. Why? Because we wanted to be able to show variation, we wanted a chart that people would use, and we thought that pediatricians might understand the concept of centile charts. So first of all, you just notice there's minutes after birth, the median, where's the median, this one? 1 minute, it's about 60%. And it's going up. Okay, over that first few minutes. But the median means 50% of normal babies are less than that. 50% are higher. It was very interesting, the big scatter. I like to take, but you decide what you want, the 10th centile. And just let me go through that. Even if you track, I'm going to say I don't want babies go below the 10th centile. 10% of normal babies will have an oxygen saturation at whatever time below the 10th centile. So here, and one of the things I like about the 10th centile is you can perhaps remember at 1 minute it's 40, at 2 minutes it's 50, at 3 minutes it's 60, at 4 minutes it's 70, at 5 minutes it's 80, 6 minutes it's 90 sort of thing. So, you know, you're going up in tens per minute. Now, the NRP have published, and the British Neonatal Life Support have published now what the recommended ranges are. And for reasons I don't understand, the NRP have more or less tracking the median. My North American colleagues are so terrified that the baby might be hypoxic even for a slight time. They would rather they over-treated babies with oxygen. So if you're going to track here, you're going to give 50% more babies oxygen than actually need it. So you can decide, 3rd, 10th, 25th, what are you going to use? And then at the top end, what are you going to use? Well, it's a bit like using growth charts. You say, well, I'm not going to worry about a child's growth unless it falls below a certain centile, and my guess is 10th centiles, not a bad thing to track. We don't want to overuse oxygen, and yet we don't want babies to stay hypoxic for too long. Now, what happens if the baby is hypoxic out here? Well, it has got a low saturation out here. The data is, and it was being shown on the first day, you do not get brain damage just through hypoxia. You've got to have ischemia, you've got to have hypotension and bradycardia. So if you've got a baby whose heart rate is good, but its oxygen's out here, don't worry about it as long as it's going up. What you don't want is it to be going down. So here we are, just a little bit to show term infants, again, like heart rate are marginally, they're statistically, but marginally lower. So we could plot for the preterm, but to me, there's so much scatter and noise in the system, I wouldn't worry about that. And now here is the sort of thing you can get. I mean, of course, this is coming up dynamically. We've got time along the bottom in seconds. So 2 minutes here. Saturation signal getting going, but is around about 40 or 50, and this baby, it falls. What does 20 mean? Well, you know, these oximeters aren't really designed to accurately measure it down here, but all I can tell you was if it's saying this, it's not 80, okay, it's not up here. And then this was tracking along, and the people by 360 seconds 6 minutes said, "Whoa, this is too low. This is way below." And there's the normal range. This is the I think this is the 10th centile I put on here, and they gave 100% oxygen, and it goes right up, and then interestingly dropped. What's that one down to? 58% oxygen there. So you can see you've got this dynamic change. You can decide. Too low, I'm going to give oxygen. Oh, it's getting a bit too high. I can turn the oxygen down. Here's another one. Now we've got heart rate on here. So it's all changing a bit. They're ventilating the baby, and I suggest from our experience, oh, look, aren't they doing well? No, the ventilation's gone wrong. Oh, they did rather well. The ventilation's gone wrong. Now they're picking up. Here they change over. Heart rate drops again, but the general tendency, and you can see. And so here's the saturation, all right? It's running at 50. That's about normal, okay? And it's not coming up, and at this point they decided, oh, we don't like that, we're giving 100% oxygen. Comes rapidly up, over-oxygenates. Drop the oxygen just to 80, come still very high. Suction, yes, this was suction. Suction's bad, gives you bradycardia, all sorts of things. Oxygen's come down, and here, look, they've gotten down to about 30% by tracking it along. I suggested if they'd been a bit more patient, they might have got up there anyway without giving the oxygen, 100% over-oxygenating and then dropping down. And I'll show you some data that even a small amount of oxygen seems to cause oxidative damage in these babies. Here's just another one. No, it's not. It's exactly the same one as I've shown you. And here's another one. Again, you're coming along. Heart rate's good. Okay, terrific. It's gone rocketing up. Note the heart rate starts low if you actually measure it. 1 minute, it's low, but it's coming up and up and up. Don't panic. Here's less than 50. Oh, my goodness, we've got to give chest compressions and give adrenaline. No, you haven't. It's changing. Leave it alone. Spontaneously breathing in air. Okay. All down here. Panic. It's too low. Give oxygen. Wallops up. Okay, and then it's over-oxygenating, and goes down to 30%. So these charts may not be perfect, but they are the best estimate of what is normal. People argue, oh, it's not really normal. Well, it's the best we've got for SpO2 in the first 10 minutes. Little bit difference between preterm and term. So what's the point of these charts? They're now published, and they can be used to help carers know whether an infant's oxygen saturation is abnormal. Neonatal teams can then decide which centiles they're going to use for their high and low, and they can use these charts. So here's a baby, it's 3 minutes of age, its oxygen saturation is, let's say, 60%. Don't worry, guys, that's normal. Keep going. Baby's heart rate's all right. 5 minutes, 70%. Don't worry about it. It's normal. It's coming up. And so the whole purpose of using the charts as much as anything is to give people confidence that they can just wait and let the baby transition. It's got to get the fluid out of its lungs. It's got to get breathing. It's not surprising it takes it several minutes to do. And this whole business of pounce on the baby, 30 seconds, you've got to be doing things. Heart rate, you know, if it's less than this, do something without looking at many of the other things. So what centiles are we going to use? You can decide for yourself. I've been concentrating on the lower one. But of course, oxygen's toxic. We don't want them to go too high as well. Okay, now we come to the, so are we going to start with 100% or are we going to start with air? This was a review published in the Lancet by my colleagues. And this was some of the things they said. Neonatal frequent, not always have a good outcome. Strong case, biological plausibility of using air rather than 100% oxygen. It's toxic. And there are now 5 studies. They've all been criticized a bit for how they were done. Not all term babies, I just point that out, we'll come down to that. But the key thing was when you, oh yes, this is Max Vento's spontaneous respiration. It is significantly slower in the ones treated with oxygen. It's only 1.5 minutes slower, but nevertheless, you know, when you're trying to get babies going, why do something which is going to make it slower? Mortality. So this is the stuff on mortality. There's the diamond. Mortality is increased by giving 100% oxygen during resuscitation of asphyxiated babies. These were all babies who were in trouble and were being resuscitated with oxygen. And you increase the mortality significantly, favors air. People don't not like this and, oh no, there must be something wrong, can't possibly be true, we don't believe it. But I think what's interesting is there is a consistency, the medians all over the line. It's not as if there's one study dominating more than others. Different people have looked at the stuff over the years and there have been more studies accumulating, but you can see that the odds ratio for mortality, they're all looking at the same data as different ways. It's not surprising that it is all more or less the same. What about preterm infants? So they were predominantly term infants, but not all, less well developed, more likely to get problems with oxygen, may have or quickly develop acute lung injury and surfactant deficiency. So there's 3 trials which have included preterms. Their criteria was greater than 1,000 grams, mortality in air 21%, 35% with 100% oxygen. So not just the term babies, the preterm babies. Look at that difference just by giving oxygen during resuscitation of these asphyxiated babies. Here's data now from a randomized trial of infants, tiny infants, less than 29 weeks, from Spain, from Max Vento's group, randomized to start in 30% or 90%. And at that time, they were just targeting 85%. This was, although the range was known, we didn't have the charts. And what was very interesting was they're targeting 85%. So the ones who start in 90, their FiO2 comes down quickly. The ones who start in 30, it goes up a little, but they are both meeting by about 5 minutes. Okay, so very important that this group, if you start high and you use a saturation target, you come down pretty quickly. Here you go up just a little, but if you're giving extra oxygen, it's only for a few minutes. Now, Max Vento's had a randomized trial here, 24 to 28 weeks, randomized 30% to 90%, different from that other one, targeted 75% at 5 minutes, 85 at 10 minutes. You know, people say we can't use charts, we're going to pick some numbers. Resuscitation, they all needed resuscitation. And they looked, this is the key thing here, at biological biomarkers of oxidative stress. So I'm not very good at this because I've never been into this area, but so we might need somebody clever like Bernard to interpret it for us. But they looked to reduce glutathione. Ratio to oxidized glutathione was determined. An evaluation of protein and DNA oxygenation. These are various markers of oxidative stress, protein, DNA, etc. So here's the smallish numbers in this study. Small babies, all had steroids, half had caesarean section, and their data was very similar. This is the FiO2. The one starting in 90 came down. The one started in 30 or 40 here came up, but they all met together in the middle. Heart rate, no difference. Doesn't matter whether you start in low oxygen or high oxygen, the heart rate comes up. We've seen that in several studies. SpO2, they were targeting the SpO2 to get it up round about 85, which they achieved. So they concluded that for these little babies, resuscitation should start with 30% titrate to avoid oxidative damage and inflammation, and I'll show you some of the outcomes. So just by starting in low oxygen, look at that difference in days of oxygen. Hey, but it was only a few minutes. It was only 5 minutes they were higher. And it's really made that big a difference. Do we believe it? Well, days of ventilation, halves. Days of CPAP, down by a third. BPD, Bernard, don't worry about all these cells, just don't give the babies oxygen. I mean, look at that. So, you know, and so, I mean, when this came out, I wrote to Max Venter and said, Max, this is just too good to be true. Just 5 minutes of extra oxygen is causing this trouble. And he sort of gave a nice Gallic shrug and said, well, this is the data, that's all we can tell you, but the oxidative stress markers are there, and now, of course, this has gone on to bigger trials. So here's the GSSG to GSH ratio, which is said to be a reliable marker of intracellular oxidative stress and redox status, was increased significantly in the group receiving higher oxygen, which confirmed previous findings indicated high oxygen exposure, reoxygenation increases oxidative stress. So here you are, this is what it was in the umbilical cord. High ox groups were up here. I've no personal knowledge of whether that's really high, but that was the low oxygen. And by day 3, it was coming back down again. But just by 5 minutes of slightly higher oxygen, we were seeing that this particular marker was up on day 1. Now we've got these urine markers, and one of these, this is for protein damage, and this is for DNA damage at 1 day and 7 days after birth. Okay, so it's a bit higher there at 1 day and still higher at 7 days. Higher at 1 day, still higher at 7 days. After just 5 minutes of extra oxygen, there are increased markers of oxidative damage. So you have to look at that data and you say, clinically, you can't hardly believe it, but hey, there's something upset this baby's system, and it's persisting at least to a week and beyond. And so we have to just be very careful that we don't give oxygen for more than we absolutely need to. And then this is an observational study of the first 10 minutes where in our particular unit the babies all were resuscitated with 100% oxygen. And then we suddenly said, this is crazy, we're starting with air. One day we changed. And so, but Jennifer had been recording the oximetry on these babies. She was a bit upset. We were upsetting her studies because right in the middle we changed. So we got, and she'd only just started, 20 here, 106 here. The median oxygen saturation at 2 minutes for this group was 84. Oxygen starting in air, 31%. Okay, 5 minutes here, but this is actually within the normal range. Many of these babies, 92% of these babies were treated with oxygen at 5 minutes. Why? Because their oxygen saturation was less than the 10th centile at 5 minutes. That was the reason for giving oxygen. And how much oxygen were we going to give? Well, there was no reason to, so we jumped straight to 100%. Interestingly, now you see the first 10 minutes, how many of these babies were hyperoxic? 80% in this group, and still 55% in this group, because at 5 minutes, 92% had suddenly jumped right up to 100% oxygen. Whoa, it went up and over-oxygenated them. Now, we've also got data from Neil Finer's group, resuscitation of preterms with air or oxygen. Their title actually says room air. I'm very allergic to people using the word room air. It gets used all the time in this concept. There it is down there, room air. It is not room air. It is medical air coming out, cold and dry out of the thing. Room air is what you and I are breathing, and is very different stuff from medical air. So anyway, less than 32 weeks resuscitated air or oxygen. The 100% was reduced after 5 minutes if the oxygen was greater than 95%. The air was increased up to 100% if the heart rate was less than 100 at 2 minutes. We now know that there will be plenty of babies whose heart rate is still down there, about a quarter of them, and they're within the normal range. But anyway, that wasn't known at that time. And the oxygen was increased in steps of 25% if the oxygen was less than 70% at 3 minutes. Normal, Neil, I'm sorry, 80% at 5 minutes, so they were giving oxygen to a lot of people who were fairly normal. Okay, so, and here you can see the oxygen percent, so these ones, the saturation's going up very quickly. You can see that they're over-oxygenating most of those babies. These, they drop down, and then because they get given oxygen, all this group had their FiO2 increased at 3 minutes. Hey, we've hardly started. The baby's still in transition. Don't worry about it. If its heart rate's good, but no, these were all got oxygen, and they came walloping up. And this data has been used to say we must give some oxygen to these preterm babies because they need it. Well, it depends on your definition of needing it. Yes, I just want to show this graph here. Percent with an SpO2 above 95%. Okay, the high group, the 100% group, you see most of these babies were hyperoxic at some time. The room air group, there were some of those got hyperoxic. So the new ILCOR recommendations 2010, thank goodness. What a battle it was to get them to change, but anyway, they've changed. Progression after initial delivery defined by simultaneous assessment, heart rate and rest. Oximetry should be used for evaluation of oxygenation because assessing colour is unreliable. Term babies begin with air rather than 100%. Supplementary oxygen should be regulated by blending air. Fi2 guided by oximetry. So what I've been telling you is what everybody's saying now. So what should we do? I think actually there's been a lot of, I mean, life's changed quite dramatically just in the last year, but a lot of people have been saying we're starting 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 100% air, whatever. No, 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 don't worry about all that. Do what you are used to doing. You put on the pulse oximeter. We start with low or air or low oxygen. Why? because Max Vento's shown that even if you start high and bring it down, and there's a number of people say, I feel more comfortable if I start high and I'll titrate it down. If you do that, you're likely to produce oxidative damage even with those small ones. Know the normal change by looking at the charts and titrate the oxygen against the saturation. Every baby is going to be different. There's no reason why we can't do the titration. What does this mean now? Resuscitation trolleys must have air oxygen blenders, and many of you probably in the audience may still not have blenders. Their trolleys have just got 100% oxygen. And of course, we need oximeters on our resuscitation trolleys for these babies. So, to improve oxygenation, start by getting the lungs open. Don't suddenly, oh my God, this baby's in trouble, give 100% oxygen. Get the lungs open, you'll find that you will oxygenate the baby. Oxygen's toxic. I haven't gone into the background, but there's plenty of it. Delays the first breath. Use pulse oximetry on the preductal side. Don't put it on the foot. I haven't gone into that. You get much delayed and lower readings on the foot. Pulse oximetry on the right hand or wrist. I prefer the wrist because if you've got big babies, you put it on the hand, they scrunch up their hand and you lose the signal. Put it on the wrist. Heart rate's low and not rising, a problem with ventilation. Appreciate the SpO2 rises slowly after birth and use charts to titrate the oxygen to the SpO2. Thank you very much. Any questions? So how many of you are using pulse oximeters in your delivery room? Almost all of you. Those who didn't put your hands up, how many are going to go back and put pulse oximeters in the delivery room? You're not? Why not?
I don't work in the delivery room. I use, but I don't work in the delivery room.
You don't want it in the delivery room?
I don't work in the delivery room.
Oh, you don't work in the delivery room?
I'm sorry, I use
Oh, that's all right. So, I mean, what has been fascinating to me, having got into this area, is that why haven't we used them in the delivery room? Every baby in the nursery's got them. If you're sick and you go into the emergency department, the first thing is they put a pulse ox on you to see if you're alive. And yet we've still been doing all this old-fashioned, I'm a clever pediatrician, I can see what the baby's like without measuring it. So, yeah, pulse oximetry, I haven't got copies of those charts, but they're all published now in Pediatrics and Archives of Disease of Childhood, and you can easily get those. Any questions?
That's me. In one of your slides, you have shown that a significant number of babies who has been given oxygen, they were hyperoxic.
Yeah.
But in the same slide, you have shown that the babies who were in room oxygen, in room air, they were hyperoxic. What do you mean by that? Can you be hyperoxic when you are in room air?
Sure. I mean, you can, you know, it's like in the nursery. I mean, you know, if you get your lungs aerated quickly and you're reasonably healthy, you can get your saturations up. Oh, can we just have that back on? Can you put the projector back on? Thanks. So here's this is the best we know about normal. And look, so this is the where's the 90th centile, so lots of babies are right up here. We're having no interventions. So if you've got your lungs well aerated, breathing air, you can have a saturation right way up above 95%. It's probably where yours is, you see, 97, 98, 90, maybe. Why deny the babies it?
Actually, my question is that, you know, does that really damage the baby? I mean, when it has been mentioned that 21% room air and the baby hyperoxic, does that mean that we should give them 19% oxygen or something like that?
Well, I mean, that's, I mean, Alan Jobe dealt with that yesterday. I mean, personally, I think we're a bit schizophrenic about this whole thing. the baby's in oxygen, even if it's just 22 or 23%, and you've got to keep it within the range, you know, whatever you're deciding, 90 to 94 or something, 88 to 92. As soon as it's in air, well, we don't mind if it's high. And the data seems to suggest that it doesn't seem to matter. So I think if the baby's looking good and it's breathing air, you say, thank goodness, I don't care if its saturation's 97%. Well done, baby, you're doing a good job. But I agree, it doesn't seem logical, but I think that's all right. You can't give it 19% anyway, so don't worry. Anybody, if I have any message, it's please get the lungs open before you even think about giving oxygen. And the other thing is, one thing about pulse ox I didn't say is, if you're going to put on the pulse ox, you need somebody at the delivery unit to do it. You can't be assessing the baby, ventilating it, and putting on the pulse ox. Okay. And sometimes with these preterm babies, we have one nurse who's your first job is to put on the pulse oximeter. Okay, get that done in the first minute, then you can be helping us with other things. But you need somebody whose job is dedicated to put that on. Now, a number of people I've talked said, that's impossible. We're lucky if we have one nurse to go with the doctor. Well, come on, this is one of the most dangerous times in life. You know, you'd be having more people in the NICU. We've got to start bringing the NICU into the delivery unit. Any more?